Good afternoon and welcome to the second meeting of the COVID-19 Committee. We are joined for our first agenda item this afternoon by John Swinney, who's the Deputy First Minister and Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills, and he'll be giving evidence on the Scottish Government's Framework for Decision Making, which was published last week. I'm aware that the Deputy First Minister has another engagement at 4 p.m, so we'll ensure that the session is wrapped up before then. Can I welcome Mr. Swinney to the meeting, and can I invite him to make a short opening statement?
Thank you very much, Convener. First of all, I would like to place on record my thanks to the people of Scotland for following the public health advice to stay at home. The impact of the virus in Scotland has been profound and everyone has been affected. While we know the current lockdown remains vital, it is only because of the action of the people of Scotland that we're now seeing some progress against the virus. First Minister explained last week that we want to be open and transparent about the options for Scotland, which is why we published COVID-19, a framework for decision making, and I welcome the opportunity to discuss this further with the committee today. It is only when we are sure that the virus is under control that we can start to ease restrictions. Our steps, when we take them, will need to be careful, gradual, incremental, and probably quite small to start with. This new normal will be different from the lives we've had before. Physical distancing and limiting our contact with others may well be a fact of life for some time to come, but we have the opportunity to work together to decide the kind of Scotland we want to emerge from this crisis. Thursday's paper sets out the objectives and the principles that will guide us, the different factors that we will need to take into account, the framework in which we will take decisions, and the preparations we need to make now. Central to that is our consideration of the harms caused by the virus to health, to society and to the economy. In the days and the weeks ahead, evidence, data and modelling will allow us to take firmer decisions, and as the First Minister has said, we will share our thinking on an ongoing and iterative basis. As the paper outlines, we will follow 7 principles for decision making. The principles will be safe, lawful, evidence-based, fair and ethical, clear, realistic and collective. We will learn from the international community, in particular those countries further ahead in the pandemic curves than Scotland. However, it is too early to tell from international comparisons what the safest and most effective approach might be. Most countries are just at the starting point of lifting interventions, and there will be a time lag between lifting and seeing the impact. In the coming days, we will publish an update to the framework. The intention is that this will include an assessment of the evidence on the spread of the virus, a summary of the restrictions currently in place, some of the options to be considered around the variation of distancing measures, and will consider the harms caused by the virus. We will consider the options set out in that paper as part of our review of the restrictions currently in place, which must be completed no later than the 7th of May. We recognise a successful transition out of the current lockdown arrangements will require unprecedented levels of support and compliance from the whole population, which means openness, transparency and a clear articulation of why specific decisions being taken are essential. We will also set out how we intend to facilitate the next phase of dialogue with the public on the COVID decision-making process in due course. And I look forward, on the basis of these comments, Convener, to addressing any further points that the committee may wish to put to me.
Thank you, Mr. Swinney. It's a very helpful opening statement, and we have members who are interested in pursuing issues around the science and the evidence base for decisions that will be taken, issues around public engagement, and around some of the practical implications of easing the current lockdown. And can I remind members, and indeed yourself, just to be aware, because of the broadcasting arrangements, if we just take a breath before speaking, that allows broadcasting to catch up. Can I maybe start by asking a little bit about the science that underpins the decision-making process that the Scottish Government will undertake in due course? Epidemiologists like Professor Neil Ferguson have stated that without a vaccine, COVID-19 could end up infecting 80% of the population. The containment strategy that's been pursued by the Scottish Government has so far been successful in suppressing the number of cases. But as the document makes clear, lockdown cannot continue forever. And if lockdown is eased, there is a risk of a second wave of transmission or indeed subsequent waves. So is it the Scottish Government's view that without a vaccine, we could still see a very large percentage of the population affected by coronavirus? And therefore, what we're trying to do is simply spread the restrict the spread of coronavirus so the impact on the NHS is contained as far as possible? Or is there a hope and expectation that the overall impact of coronavirus could be restricted below that sort of level?
Our hope, Convener, would be to restrict the spread of coronavirus to the lowest level possible within our society. So whilst I understand and respect the information that Professor Ferguson sets out, and there's a huge amount of very valuable material that he generates, I don't think we're necessarily obliged to accept that the type of scenario he paints is an inevitable scenario. If there is, within the public, a very sustained approach towards some of the very basic elements of behaviour which we have encouraged throughout this pandemic, around hand washing, around what has now become known as coughing etiquette, around the application of social distancing, and some of the other elements of the measures that we have put in place, then we would be working to try to minimise the effect of the spread of the virus. But I think we have to accept that what we have learned through the lockdown is that the type of very restrictive arrangements that we've had in place have been effective in slowing up the spread of the virus. So there may be variations, not of perpetual lockdown, because I accept your premise, Convener, that we cannot be in lockdown forever, and that would not be desirable or palatable. There may be changes to the way we live our lives and how we act and how we travel and how we conduct ourselves that have to change to try to minimise the spread of coronavirus. And that will be very much at the heart of the next phase of the agenda that the government takes forward.
Thank you for that response. Other members I know want to come in and ask a bit more about the science behind some of the assumptions in the paper. But I wonder if I can move on and ask a different question. This is about some of the impact of lockdown, particularly on the business community, which I think you would recognise has responded very well in the main to the arrangements that have been put in place. And many businesses have taken the decision to close voluntarily. They've not been legally obliged to do so. They've closed voluntarily, they've furloughed their staff. But of course, they are keen to return to work. And from an economic point of view, I think we'd all want to see people back at work as soon as that's safe to do so. So what we've seen just in the last couple of days, I'm sure you've seen, is some large construction companies talking about a return to work in May, of course, exercising social distancing. Can I ask you, what's the Scottish Government's view on that, and what advice would you give to companies like that who clearly have to do some planning ahead about going back to work? They can't just make that decision and take people back to work the following day. What advice would you give to those companies and indeed to their workforce who might have their own concerns about their safety?
The paper that we've constructed, Convener, tries to, I think, properly and comprehensively tabulate the harm that's caused by COVID, and it sets out essentially 4 harms of COVID. There is the direct health harm from COVID, which has been the absolute primary requirement for the lockdown because of the dangers that COVID health harm posed to the population. And I think we are making significant progress as a consequence of the participation of members of the public and the business community in the lockdown in tackling that direct COVID health harm. There is also the non-COVID health harm, which is affecting the population. The level of referrals by general practitioners for cancer treatment has fallen by over 70% in Scotland. Now, none of us believe that cancer has reduced to that extent in our society. So quite clearly, members of the public are holding back in coming forward with their wider health issues, and that's undesirable. There's then the social harm. I'm acutely aware of the challenges that are facing families in our communities, where there is very significant disruption and damage being created by COVID, and for our young people, the loss of formal education services is a very significant factor. And then, as you correctly say, Convener, in the business community, there has been a very significant economic impact as a consequence. Now, what the paper tries to do is to open up a discussion about the fact that we need to consider our next steps consistent with all of those different factors as they affect our society, because we can see in each one on direct COVID health harm, non-COVID health harm, social and economic issues, there is damage to Scottish society as a consequence. What the paper tries to do is to open up a discussion about how we can make progress on some of these questions, which brings me to the issue that you raise about the construction sector. We are going through a process in which we will provide advice to the public, which takes into account the best modelling information that we have and which signals when we consider it safe, based on the best modelling information and scientific advice that we have, for certain activities to resume in at particular stages. So at this stage, there is nothing that I can say which says we should change our disposition from what the government has previously set out. Now, I hope we get to a point sooner rather than later that we can change that disposition, but we're not in that situation just now, for a very fundamental reason, which is narrated in the paper, that we have to make sure that the reproduction number of the coronavirus is kept as low as possible. And just now, we don't believe it is low enough to enable us to resume some of the wider activity that I quite readily acknowledge individuals and companies wish to take forward. But the assurance I would give you, Convener, and to wider business sectors, is that the government will not hold back a minute longer than we have to in judging that issue about safety of the public and the containment of coronavirus.
Thank you, Deputy First Minister. That's very helpful to get that steer from you. I'm now going to bring in Shona Robson, who I think has some questions around the evidence and around public engagement.
Good afternoon. I think the framework's a very, very good document, and I think it's right that it's one that's going to be built upon. And I just wonder if I could turn first of all to the covering letter that you with the framework, where you talk about the document sets out some of the challenges which you've just spoken about and the principles that are going to guide the decisions that are made. And you go on to say it will be updated as evidence modelling and our assessment of the different options open to us develop. It would be helpful just to hear a little bit about what those sources of evidence and information will be and what relative weight are given to those, because it may be the case that you get differing opinions, different expert advice. Those will be difficult to wrestle with. How will the government try to distill some of that and then apply judgment to the options going forward?
There is always on all questions, and I'm certainly seized of this in my core education portfolio, there is always a range of opinions about how best to proceed. And any observer of the debate that is currently underway around coronavirus will recognise that within the scientific community there is quite a diversity of opinion about different approaches to take. The government listens carefully to a wide range of scientific opinion. Obviously, we have the benefit of hearing the material that is discussed within the SAGE group, which is a United Kingdom government grouping, to which we have access. We have also established an advisory group for the Chief Medical Officer, which is convened by Professor Andrew Morris, and it brings together a really broad cross-section of scientific opinion to try to essentially take some of the SAGE advice and wider advice and distill that into some of the issues that the Scottish Government and Scottish society need to be aware of. There is, of course, also the work that is undertaken within government in a number of different areas of activity to essentially model impacts. Some of it can be the modelling of the impact of coronavirus as a direct health harm to the population. Some of it can be the modelling of economic impact in the way that the convener was raising with me a second ago, and which the chief economist set out at one of the First Minister's briefings just the other day there. We also benefit from the input from the Chief Social Work Advisor and the Chief Social Policy Advisor within the government in helping us to form our views, along with the Chief Scientist and the Chief Scientific Advisor into the bargain. All of that information is distilled, and I think the best way to tackle that diversity of opinion is to follow the thinking behind the document, and that is to be as open and as transparent as possible about that information, so that it is shared widely, it's understood by the public, and the government makes its best judgments openly and in a transparent fashion based on that evidence. Now, that will not mean that we can accept all the scientific advice, because some of the scientific advice may be contradictory, or it will be contradictory. But what we have to do is to make our best judgment based on the evidence we have in front of us, the advice that is presented, and to explain that in an open fashion to the public to build consent and support for the position that we take.
In your opening remarks about learning from other countries and looking at the international evidence, and you caveated that by saying that they were all at very early stages of perhaps easing restrictions. It does strike me that that's going to be very important, but also quite key. If you look at the situation in Germany, they are now beginning to see some rise in cases again. So is it the case that the options may have to change as circumstances change, and that there'll have to be a fluidity? So if you set down on one path and you see a rise in cases, you may have to change that very quickly. Presumably that will be built in to the thinking.
Right at the heart of the document that we've published, and the steps that we intend to take to take forward our decision making, we make it clear that suppressing the virus is the most important consideration. So, because without that, there runs the risk that we could see our National Health Service overwhelmed. Now, because of the tremendous commitment of National Health Service staff over the course of the last few months, we have managed to build capacity, reconfigure our National Health Service with a speed and a focus which has been absolutely laudable by all of those individuals. And it's got us to a point where our National Health Service has not in any shape or form been overwhelmed, and has had ample capacity within its operations to deal with the challenge of coronavirus. But that's come at a price to non-COVID health conditions, which have not been attended to, as I've accepted already in my evidence. So, right at the heart of all of this, we recognise the danger that coronavirus poses to the population, and the necessity to ensure that our health service remains robust and able to handle the impact of coronavirus. So if we took steps, for example, which then resulted in a rise in caseload and a movement in the opposite direction to the one that we want to see, we would of course have to reapply measures to try to protect the fundamentals of society and to protect the ability of the National Health Service to provide that assurance to members of the public. So looking at other international examples and seeing the experience of other countries, I think can help to inform the debate and perhaps provide some of the rationale and the context that the public would require to understand about why government is perhaps not moving as fast as people would like government to move to relax the restrictions. And the reason why we can't move that fast is because it would be dangerous to the public for us to do so. Fundamentally, the issue we have to keep looking at is where is the reproduction number of coronavirus, where are the number of cases, and if we find them moving in the opposite direction to the one we're trying to secure of reducing the number of cases, reducing the reproduction number, then we potentially would have to reapply some of the restrictions that we might have lifted.
Shona, the microphone is not. Shona, apologies, the microphone did not pick up the start of your question there. Can you maybe just start again, please?
Yes, of course. I was just saying, finally, just to ask about the involvement and consent of the public, which you mentioned yourself and Mr. Russell yesterday in response to my question, talked about the Scottish Government putting some thought to how the public could be involved in the conversation that the framework is intending to start and keep going. Have you any further thoughts or is there any further developments on how the practicalities of how that might happen?
At the very first moment of the publication of the document, or in its first 7 days or so, we have seen the document either viewed or downloaded about 400,000, over 400,000, about 400,000 occasions. And that's a significant indication of the interest of members of the public in the issues with which we are grappling with. And we've obviously provided within the document an opportunity for members of the public to send their feedback directly to us. Now, this is not a routine government consultation document. We can't wait 12 weeks for members of the public to have their opportunity to feedback. We need to find a more immediate way of doing that so we can hear what the public are saying, what the reactions are to certain issues. And of course, that will become ever more clear the more we furnish the framework document with further information about the options that we will be considering and the options that we will be modelling. So it's really important we get that direct feedback from members of the public. Now, we're looking actively just now at some mechanisms that would enable that more vigorous public interaction with the document. We hope to be able to say some more details about that in the course of the next few days, so that there's a very direct channel for members of the public to input their thinking, that we can gather that on a prompt and efficient fashion, so that the government can be really closely aware of what members of the public are thinking about the different options with which we are wrestling. But we are keen to make sure this is done in a fashion which is different to traditional government consultation mechanisms, which essentially we publish a document and wait a number of weeks before we hear anything from members of the public. This is too immediate for us to as an issue, to leave it that long. So we want to make sure we hear that feedback from the public as swiftly as possible.
Okay, thank you, Shona. Just before I bring in Ross Greer, who's the next questioner, if I could just follow up, Mr. Swinney, with that last question from Shona Robson about public engagement. I mean, what role would you see for this committee of Parliament being able to be a forum for bringing forward views to the government?
I think that would be a very welcome platform, convener. I think the formation of the committee is an indication by Parliament of the recognition of the seriousness of the issues that are faced. There are obviously subject committees that can look at a variety of different issues within their own responsibilities, but I think the COVID committee provides a gathering place for some of that thinking. I very much welcome this opportunity to be able to explain in more detail the thinking that's gone into the framework document. And I know that ministers, I certainly for one, and other ministers would be happy to appear before the committee to address any issues. And of course, if we would be keen, as we hear views of members of the public, to make sure that's widely shared, and the committee may have a role to perform in scrutinising some of that thinking and the response of the government to these questions. I suspect in the course of this evidence session today, I will not be able to provide definitive points to the committee about steps that we might take, but we will get to the point where we take definitive steps and we should be scrutinised for those definitive steps, and ministers will be happy to engage with the committee on those and any other questions.
Thank you. That's very helpful, and committee members will reflect on how best we can help in assessing that public opinion and helping bring it forward. Okay, next to ask a question is Ross Greer, please.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to ask about suppression as an objective, as the Deputy First Minister's outlined. That's not the objective that some other countries are pursuing here. So New Zealand's strategy, as mentioned in their National Action Plan, remains to eliminate COVID-19 and to stamp out transmission within affected clusters. Other countries like Vietnam, which is obviously far larger than New Zealand or Scotland, have pursued this strategy very successfully as well. There's a big difference between a suppression strategy and elimination. Suppression is premised on minimising harm until a vaccine's developed. And in evidence to the Health Committee yesterday, Professor Hugh Pennington said that he advised the Scottish Government to pursue elimination, and he argued that an aggressive test, trace and isolate strategy might actually make that possible by Christmas. So I was wondering if the Cabinet Secretary could outline why the Scottish Government is pursuing suppression rather than elimination as its strategy.
I think there's, in a sense, the difference in points that have been expressed here, I don't actually think is that significant, because I cannot see how the agenda we are taking forward and the steps that we take in trying to tackle coronavirus will involve anything other than a test, trace and isolate strategy as part of the actions that we take. So the framework document looks at various steps that we might take when we establish some headroom between the reproduction number and the level by which our National Health Service cannot cope with the impact of COVID. But as part of that measure, of those measures, I think we would inevitably have to pursue, well, it's not inevitably, we will pursue a test, trace and isolate strategy. So I think the objective of the government is to ensure that we eliminate coronavirus. The terminology I would use and have used is to suppress the virus as far as we can, and to use techniques such as test, trace and isolate to secure that objective. But it will be an essential part of the response of the government from where we are today to where we need to get to tackle the effect of COVID in our society.
So just to clarify that, is the government's objective to achieve the level of elimination that has been achieved in countries like New Zealand and Vietnam in the absence of a vaccine? And the Deputy First Minister's contention here is essentially this is a difference in language between suppression and elimination. It'd be helpful if you could confirm that what the government is attempting in the absence of a vaccine is an elimination strategy.
Well, I'm not trying to be difficult here, but we are trying to do both. We're trying to get a vaccine and we're trying to reduce the impact of COVID as far as we possibly can do in the absence of a vaccine. Now, if that is so successful that it reduces the effect of COVID to the point where we are, in many respects, less dependent on a vaccine, then that will be a major success of the strategy that we take forward. But I don't think we should simply say that it's an either or, is the point I'm trying to make. We are keen to secure a vaccine to give us long-term security from COVID-19, but we're equally trying to be as effective as we possibly can be in the short, medium and long term in suppressing the effect of COVID-19 on our society. And that's the entire focus of all the measures that we take forward. There isn't a level COVID presence in our society that ministers are keen to tolerate. That's not our objective. We want to protect the population from COVID, and we will do all that we can through the measures that we take to do so, whether that involves a vaccine or it does not involve a vaccine.
Thanks for that. And to be clear, of course, I acknowledge that the government are pursuing a vaccine as part of the strategy, but these questions are about what we do until and unless that vaccine's there. So I'm wondering if I could ask what assessments have been made of the impact of any delays in the procurement of a vaccine, the discovery and the procurement of a vaccine.
Clearly, the earlier a vaccine, well, in a sense, we come back to some of the material that I've just rehearsed in the last answer, that we want to, society is not functioning as we are all accustomed to it just now because of the presence of COVID. So we have to remove that threat from our society. Now, if we are successful in removing it by the various measures that we take, the observance of social distancing, the cough etiquette, the wearing of face coverings in certain circumstances, the test, trace, isolate strategy, and the various other measures that we take, then that will represent positive progress in the tackling of COVID. But obviously, there is the possibility that the virus could make a reappearance simply because it hadn't been eliminated in its absolute entirety. So the question of a vaccine becomes relevant to provide long-term assurance for the population. Now, obviously, in the absence of that vaccine, then is the greater likelihood that we have to consider restrictive measures of some sort to try to help us to deal with the virus within our society, whether that's around the discipline that would be required around test, trace and isolate, and the other restrictions that might be in place in society, or other restrictions that we might have to consider in due course. So it's about so if we want a vaccine for long-term assurance, then the sooner that can be available, the better. But we certainly cannot pursue a strategy which operates on the basis that there is nothing we should be doing until we get a vaccine. There's a lot we should be doing before we get a vaccine, and the government's document is focused on how we might assemble all of that approach together to make sure we're effective in that respect.
Thank you. And finally, and I hope briefly, a question about the evidence base for the Scottish Government's decision making, going back to previous discussions with the convener and Shona Robinson. There's obviously been some public concern about the evidence that governments are taking in the UK about who does and does not get to contribute at meetings of SAGE, the UK advisory group, for example. But you mentioned the Scottish Government's COVID-19 advisory group. The advice that this group provides has not yet, or is not currently being published, and the minutes of its meetings are really very sparse. But clearly, the evidence base the government is using has shifted. It was only a few weeks ago that the Chief Medical Officer said that testing only works in a window of symptomatic people. We're now in a place where Scottish Government policy is to test all over 70s on admission to hospitals, including people who are not symptomatic. So clearly, the evidence base there must have shifted. So I'm wondering if the Cabinet Secretary could explain how the Scottish Government's taken this advice and how the Scottish Government plans on putting advice into the public domain to ensure there is public confidence in it.
Over the course of the last few weeks, the government has engaged in very open communication around all aspects of the issues in connection with COVID. In fact, I can hardly think of a limited number of issues the government has dealt with other than COVID, to be honest. So that's really the starting point to my answer, which is about making sure that I assure the committee of the government's commitment to very open dialogue around these questions. There will be a range of advice, as Shona Robertson put to me in her question, that comes to government. We have to evaluate that. We have to make a judgment about what we consider to be the most compelling response we can give to that advice, and then to set out openly and clearly why we have come to those conclusions. And obviously, the input that we get from the Chief Medical Officer's Advisory Group is very helpful in that respect. We've published the names of the members of that committee. As Mr. Greer says, we published the minutes, and obviously the scientific information and advice that we receive from that forms part of the judgment that the government openly sets out on a daily basis in the briefings that are given by the First Minister or the Health Secretary, and also in the scrutiny that's undertaken by parliamentary committees. And I'm certain that the government will be very happy to engage further with parliamentary committees on any further scrutiny that may be required in that respect.
Forgive me, Cabinet Secretary, will you publish the advice?
I'll take that issue away to consider with other ministers and come to a judgment about that, and I'm very happy to advise the committee on that basis.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Greer. Thank you, Mr. Swinney. Before we move on, I have Monica Lennon wanting to ask commentary.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, just a very brief supplementary on the back of Ross Spear's question about the elimination strategy. He mentioned New Zealand and Vietnam as two examples. I don't know so much about the Vietnam experience, but I wonder if Scottish Government is picking up the phone to other countries. Have there been any discussions with, for example, the Government of New Zealand to find out more about the measures they've taken, if we can learn from that example? Thank you.
There's certainly, the government is looking very carefully at, as I said in my opening statement, at international evidence and advice. We're obviously talking to a range of different countries around the world to identify what are the steps that are being taken. Our scientific community is well connected to the international community, and obviously that advice is flowing into the Chief Medical Officer's Advisory Group, into the bargain, and into the work of our Chief Medical Officer. So yes is the short answer to the fact that we're talking to other countries and understanding the issues and the perspectives with which they are wrestling.
Okay, thank you for that. My next questioner is Willie Coffey. Just before I bring in Willie, I just want to observe, looking at the clock, we've had quite long questions and answers so far, and we are due to finish by 4 o'clock to let Mr. Swinney away. So we have slightly shorter questions and answers. I think that would be helpful. Willie.
Okay, thank you, Convener. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if the government is currently looking at what the arrangements might be for the variety of our high street businesses post-lockdown for reopening? Clearly there will be different arrangements in place depending on the nature of the business. Are we thinking about what these arrangements are just now and preparing any guidance for them so that they can operate safely when they're allowed to reopen?
Across a range of sectors, Convener, the government is engaged in dialogue about what recovery might look like in each particular sector, and the Economy Secretary, Fiona Hislop, has been involved in very sustained discussions with all sectors of the economy and the business community on what the arrangements might be like should we get to the point of being able to move forward from lockdown. Now, I stress we are not yet at that point, but we are having those discussions so that we can understand what might be the impact of some of the continuation of the measures that we have in place. And social distancing is going to have to become a fact of life for the foreseeable future. So high street businesses reopening will have to think through how can they operate in that context. Now, of course, some food retailers have gone through that process already and have reconfigured their business propositions very significantly to take that into account. So that dialogue is underway, led by the Economy Secretary, and that is also going on in a range of other sectors where ministers are actively involved in those discussions.
Thank you for that, John. We know that some countries like Denmark and Switzerland have allowed some businesses to reopen on their high streets, but all of them with clear guidelines about safe operation. Are we having a little look across the water just to see how well any of those arrangements are working, given that we know that we're slightly behind them in the pandemic at the moment?
We are looking carefully at other countries and seeing their experience, to see the measures that they have taken, the approaches that they've taken. That's, as I said in my previous answer, happening across a range of different areas of activity within Scottish society in which ministers and officials are involved. There will, of course, to go back to the question that Shona Robertson put to me about the example in Germany, also be the experience of seeing some of the implications of relaxation of measures and some of the complications and difficulties that can present for the approach that's been taken to tackle coronavirus. So there will be a lot of learning to be undertaken from listening to other countries who are at a different stage in the handling of the pandemic, and it's a really valuable source of intelligence for us in forming the approaches that we may wish to take.
My final question to you, John, it's about the online phone order issue and so on, and safe delivery to people's homes. Some businesses have adapted really, really well using online and phone ordering, with safe deliveries being made to people's homes. Is this all okay as far as the government is concerned, even if the particular business activity isn't exactly essential in the fight against coronavirus? I mean, safe deliveries can take place at home, as we know. Does the government share that view that that's okay to continue that practice?
Fundamentally, we would want any business to operate within a safe environment that protects their employees and a safe environment that protects customers in every respect. Now, there's been a huge amount of willing voluntary cooperation from the business community for the restrictions that have been put in place, and many organisations have exercised a tremendous public spiritedness in contributing towards this effort. And I recognise that becomes ever more challenging for as long as business activity is either paused or operating in this very different fashion. And I think the point I'd want to stress to the committee is that on an ongoing basis, I cannot see how we will not have the presence of social distancing and some of the other restrictions that we put in place. So businesses really have to think through what are the adaptations and approaches they need to take to make sure that they have in place all of the necessary protections for their staff and for their customers. And they also have to be mindful of the strategic advice, which is that we are saying to people, only make journeys if they are absolutely essential. Do not leave the house unless you are working on an essential business. Only go to the shops on an infrequent basis and for pharmacy trips. So there's a wider context that businesses are operating within, where they have to be mindful of the wider public health advice, which is of such significance in protecting the public.
Okay, thank you, John. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Willie. My next questioner is Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you, Convener. I wanted to ask about the R number. And given that this is an important aspect of government policy, the framework published last week is very clear that the R number, or transition rate, is an important factor, and it has to stay below 1 to avoid exponential growth. On page 11 of the framework, it says that the current estimate is that R is between 0.6 and 1.0, and that seems quite a wide margin given its importance. So could I ask Mr. Swinney how the number is calculated, and can different R numbers be created for different parts of Scotland, or is it statistically better to have an R number using data from across the UK, given that we have a unified lockdown at the moment?
The R number is, I would describe as critical to the discussions that we are having on this question, and it is essentially the fundamental piece of information upon which we have to focus. And the Beatrice Bishop mentioned the fact that in the document the estimate is between 0.6 and 1. I don't think it's quite firm enough to say that it just has to be below 1 to allow us to perhaps feel as if we're making headway. It has to be well below 1, because the current estimate, the most recent estimate I've seen, is that the R number is sitting at about 0.7. Now, that does not suggest there is a vast amount of difference between that level and a level at which our health service would have real difficulty in coping with the health-related harm coming from COVID. So we need to be undertaking sustained measures to reduce that R number. And of course, that has happened because the estimate was that the R number was probably in excess of 3 when the lockdown measures happened. So there's been huge progress made by the cooperation of members of the public. Now, the R number is essentially produced by the number of cases that are identified and the amount of time it takes for the virus to reproduce amongst other individuals. And in terms of, we can be fairly confident about the level of the R number across Scotland. Because it's based on modelling information, I think the smaller the geography you begin to come down to into component parts of Scotland, I think the more challenging the modelling would become. And I'm quite certain the Chief Statistician of the Scottish Government would be able to explain, it may actually be a valuable discussion for the committee to have, to explain some of those variables, because he and I have discussed these questions about what might be the opportunity to identify in different parts of Scotland, did we have a different position as a consequence of the modelling information. And certainly the sense that I got from those conversations is that the more we try to come down to a smaller population cohort, the more challenging it will be to arrive at a reliable number. So I think we have to have the public very firmly focused on the importance of reducing the R number to create the maximum headroom between the R number and 1 to enable us to take any decisions that might relax the current provisions we have in place. And as things stand just now, I'm certainly not seeing in the information I've seen to date a level of comfort that would allow us to relax the lockdown measures because of where the R number is currently sitting.
Thank you, Mr. Swinney. That's very helpful. Elsewhere in the document, there's a number of other factors that will be taken into consideration beyond the transmission rate. And some of these competing priorities could even become contradictory. I mean, on page 13, it says that our values matter too. And on page 6, it says to listen to the people of Scotland. And on page 14, a factor is to see how well any measures can be communicated. So I wonder how these different factors are weighted into the decision making along with the R number.
The R number is the absolutely critical factor, because unless that is reducing further, we do not have headroom to relax the lockdown. And so therefore, the importance of members of the public actively cooperating with the measures that we have set out has been great so far, and it's essential that that is sustained in the period going forward. Now, as we begin to consider what steps we might take to relax the lockdown, we begin to, as Beatrice Wisher, I think, fairly sets out, a number of choices which can often be competing choices and competing issues. If we take the framework itself, the framework talks about 4 harms: the COVID health harm, the non-COVID health harm, social harm, and economic harm. They are all harms, but there are elements of them that are perhaps in conflict with each other. So we have to essentially wait till we have headroom from the reduction in the R number, and in the process have a debate with members of the public about what might be the most important steps to take to move on from where we are today. Where do the public think we should, where is public opinion in terms of what should be the next steps that we take? And some of those will be, well, inevitably will be different from each other. And of course, we may not have the capacity in the headroom between R and the level at which the National Health Service is unable to cope to do all of them. You know, for example, members of the public might say to them, look, we'd like to, as Mr. Coffey has just done, we'd like to see high street shops open a bit more. And they might say, we also want to see the schools open. And there might not be enough headroom between R and the point at which the health service is overwhelmed to do both. So we'd have to make judgments and explain why we consider a particular judgment to have been the valid judgment. But that's where the engagement with the public is so critical, to make sure we have the opportunity to understand public opinion and to respond accordingly.
Thank you, Mr. Swinney, and thank you, Convener. That was my final question, and I'm sorry I should have said so at the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, Beatrice. I'm now moving on to Annabel Ewing, please. Sorry, Annabel, your microphone is still muted, Annabel. Can we unmute Annabel's microphone, please? I think we're struggling. Can I suggest, Annabel, we'll come back to you in a second, Annabel. Maybe just move on to Monica Lennon first and we'll come back to you, Annabel. If Monica is able to come in.
Yeah, yep. Thank you, Convener. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, Cabinet Secretary. I was listening to one of your earlier answers to Shona Robeson, where you said that the NHS, because of all the changes, is not overwhelmed and has ample capacity, although we know that there are other issues that have arisen because of that. But today we learned more about the pattern of COVID-19 deaths that are occurring, and we know that, that there's more deaths occurring now in care homes than in hospitals. One of the newspapers today ran a headline saying that one person is dying every 30 seconds in a care home, every 30 minutes from COVID. So whilst it's important we talk about the framework and decision making, we still have this very immediate issue. I just wondered if thought has been given to what more we can do around the care sector, and in particular the NHS Louisa Jordan, which I know is there as part of the emergency planning for the NHS, but that's currently not being used as far as I know. So is there a possibility that that could be used to treat, test and isolate care home residents or older and vulnerable people who are still very much at the epicentre of the crisis?
The first thing I'd say, Kavira, is I recognise the significance of the issues that Monica Lennon raises about the care home sector. And it is important that the sector is properly and effectively supported to provide the care that all of us would want to see for individuals who are living in care homes. Now, I think some of the work that's been undertaken, for example, where there has been, as I indicated in my earlier answer to Shona Robison, there has been capacity within the health service. The health service are now looking to provide support directly into care homes, and indeed the health secretary has instructed public health directors to work very closely with the care home sector to ensure that the significant issues receive the support to which they are entitled. The NHS staff are also working with the care home sector to ensure that proper support is made available, and that's in addition, of course, obviously to the work that's been undertaken with the direct distribution of PPE support into the care home sector to ensure that the proper arrangements can be put in place. So there are, where we have unused capacity within the health service, it can be deployed into the care home sector. I think I would be, I'm not sure I'm well positioned to give an answer on the Louisa Jordan case, because what would strike me is that where residents are living in a care home and where, well, it is their home, it might be enormously disruptive to move them from there to the Louisa Jordan, where it may be better to put more nursing capacity into care homes to support individuals where they can be isolated within their own rooms within care homes. So that would be my, as Monica Lennon will appreciate, I'm not as close to these issues as the Health Secretary will be, but that would be my judgment about what would be best for what is what we all know to be a very frail group within our society already, and many individuals in our care homes may be suffering also from dementia, and therefore the ability of giving them support in an environment with which they are familiar is a very important part of the support for those individual patients. But whatever approach we take, we have to make sure that those individuals are getting the support to which they are entitled.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, and I'm actively involved in some of these discussions with the Health Secretary, but it's just good to know that things are not being ruled out. Coming back to the framework document, the document acknowledges that any transition arrangements as we come out of lockdown must look at the impact on different groups. And sticking with older people, Donald McCaskill of Scottish Care recently said that blanket restrictions on people over 70, for example, who might be expected to socially distance for longer than the rest of the population, would be unethical and discriminatory. So I just wonder, Cabinet Secretary, what your view or what the government's view is on this, and can you rule out that Scotland would impose age restrictions as we lift lockdown?
I think, Convener, that Monica Lennon raises one of the most difficult issues that we have to look at, because on the one hand, we know from the data, and we had a vivid reminder of it at the First Minister's briefing today with the information that Monica Lennon has cited, that COVID-19 is having a disproportionately severe effect on the elderly within our society. So there is a very direct COVID health harm that is damaging to members of our society. But equally, there are members of our society who are over 70 who I quite understand are feeling enormous frustration, loneliness, anxiety, worry, because they're not with their loved ones and they're not able to see their loved ones. And we're all conscious of this. So that essentially is the dilemma that we can only resolve by good dialogue and good decision making. And that's why we've set out the paper here, to try to provide the range of choices that face us as a society and as a country, and to enable there to be a discussion about those issues to inform decision making. So I'm not in a position today to say which side of that argument the government comes down on, because the government hasn't come to a conclusion about that. But what we've tried to do in the paper is set out the type of considerations that we have to bear in mind. Ethical considerations are one of those. Issues of equalities and human rights are another aspect that we have to be mindful of. So we have to have a rounded discussion of all of these questions as we wrestle with what are very clearly difficult decisions as a consequence of the situation in which we find ourselves.
Thank you, and I appreciate these are not easy questions or issues, and I understand why the Cabinet Secretary wouldn't want to preempt any decisions. I just wonder, because I know other members have talked about the challenges we'll face in engaging the public fully in this, and that need to have public consent and to have buy-in. Is the Cabinet Secretary aware of how other countries have handled this? I'm aware there's been some legal challenges in other parts of the world, and in other countries like France, they've come up against like huge public resistance. But you know, we need to look at the evidence scientifically and clinically, and also look at what the law says in terms of human rights. So is this an issue that the government is actively seeking legal advice on at the moment?
The framework that we have set out is designed to essentially provide the public with a very clear understanding of all of the factors that we have to take into account into coming to our decisions. And of course, one of the key considerations is that whatever we do must be lawful. Now, Monica Lennon will know that I'm not at liberty to disclose whether we take or have not taken legal advice, but I can say that in the document, what we must do must be lawful. So there are a whole range of different considerations that have to be reflected on by ministers. We are trying to avoid compartmentalised decisions. We're trying to take holistic decisions. We're trying to take holistic decisions across many of the ethical questions we face. We're trying to take holistic decisions around the societal issues that we face, about the issues about the effect on the economy, or the effect on our society, or the effect on non-COVID related health issues. So that's a broad discussion, but the fundamental point, which I accept from Monica Lennon's question, is that there has to be very, very good public engagement and dialogue. And that's why we're giving such thought to how do we get that in real time, in live time from members of the public, not several weeks down the road in a normal government consultation approach. So we're spending quite a bit of time trying to make sure we can find the right means, hear those views from the public, and obviously we'll listen carefully to what members of Parliament say to us as well, given the contact that members of Parliament will be having through their own dialogue with members of the public and their own constituency caseload.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Swinney. In view of the time, I think we need to move on, and I'm going to go back to Annabel Ewing in the hope that this time we'll be able to hear what you're saying, Annabel. I'm not hearing Annabel. I'm assuming nobody else is hearing her either. Sorry, Annabel, we'll go and try and fix the gremlins in the system. I think we'll go on to Adam Tompkins, please. Adam.
Thank you, Convener. Good afternoon, everyone. Cabinet Secretary, I know that there are lots of broader economic and social considerations that the government must weigh in the balance as it grapples with this question of how and when to ease the lockdown. But I want, for the purposes of these questions, if I may, to put all of those on one side and focus only and entirely on health. And you've been very clear in your evidence of this afternoon that you and government colleagues are, of course, aware that there are not only COVID-related health risks, but there are also a whole series of really quite scary, really quite serious non-COVID related health risks associated with the restrictions that have rightly been imposed on all of us. I just want to understand a bit more than I've been able to so far about how the government weighs those non-COVID health risks against the COVID health risks. You talked about tabulation. We can tabulate the number of hospital admissions with regard to COVID. We can tabulate the number of COVID deaths. How do we tabulate the risk to mental health that is being caused by isolation? How do we tabulate the fact that cancer treatments are down by more than half? How do we tabulate the fact that cardiology wards are operating at 50% of their normal capacity? And how do we then weigh that against the risks that we know are there with regard to coronavirus?
I think this is an issue of fundamentally very difficult issue to reconcile, but I think the best way to try to think it through is to think about what COVID would have done. What effect would COVID have had on our society had we not taken the actions that we had taken? And I think it's pretty fair to say the health service would have been overwhelmed, and we would have had much more rapid spread of coronavirus in our society. With, if you can overwhelm something twice, the National Health Service overwhelmed twice, and widespread prevalence in our society. So that, if the National Health Service had been overwhelmed by that, then various other non-COVID health harms we would not be able to manage them either. So COVID has presented an emergency threat to which we have had to respond, and in the process we have had to essentially pause a certain amount, not all non-COVID health activity, but some non-COVID health activity. And I suppose the point I'm trying to get across is that it would have helped absolutely nobody if the health service had been overwhelmed by COVID. And in the management and suppressing of COVID, we have an opportunity to then tackle some of the other issues. But where I accept the challenge that Mr. Tompkins puts to me is that out of COVID, there will be a variety of other non-health harms that will probably be intensified as a consequence, particularly in relation to mental health. And there will also be a certain number of conditions which are, in certain patients, more acute by the time they come to be addressed than if they've been addressed in the fashion to which we would ordinarily have wished that to be the case. So the decision-making process essentially relates to the way I answered the question from Beatrice Wishart, which is that by the mechanism that allows us to move on any front, whether it's non-COVID health or society or the economy, is by getting the R number down as low as we possibly can and creating the headroom between that R number and the point that we know the health service will not be able to cope. And within that headroom, make a judgment about what we consider to be the most appropriate steps that we can take to use that headroom for wider societal benefit. Now, Mr. Tompkins presses me on the non-COVID health harm, but others would press me on reviving the economy, and others would press me on getting the schools back and getting the adult daycare centres back. And the purpose of the framework is to say, and what I said in my initial remarks, we're going to have to take some incremental steps, probably small incremental steps out of this, whilst also accepting that some of the ways in which we've lived our lives up until now might not be possible in in the period that lies ahead.
I'm grateful for that answer, and I agree with everything that the Deputy First Minister has to say in his response to my first question. But the framework document for decision making, which was very helpfully published by the Scottish Government last week, and I welcomed the publication of that document, says that the government proposes regular monitoring of other health harms stemming from COVID-19 in order to validate existing assessment. I fully accept that there are lots of other considerations that must also at the same time be added to the mix, which make it even more complicated, including the economic issues and issues with regard to schooling, what the Deputy First Minister has referred to. But I'm just trying to understand how those risks are tabulated, monitored, weighed against each other. I suppose, to put it in the vernacular, which may or may not be helpful, again, just focusing on the health considerations, is there a point at which the cure becomes worse than the disease? I suppose that's what I'm sort of trying to drive at. And the Deputy First Minister seems, if I've understood him, to say that there is a point at which the cure becomes worse than the disease, but that point is reached only when the R number is driven down as far as it possibly can be, and 0.7 seems to be still too high because it doesn't create enough headroom to enable us to begin to relax the lockdown. Would that be a fair way of summarising the government's position?
Certainly, the point that Mr Tompkins makes, that the R number isn't low enough to give us comfort to start relaxing measures, is an absolutely fair summary of the government's position. So we need to see that reducing further, and we hope that that will be the case. And as each day goes by, we see more encouraging information on hospital admissions and ICU admissions that gives us greater confidence that we are making headway in the tackling of coronavirus. But the wider non-COVID health issues that are not being addressed, we will have very good data on comparative presentation performances. Now, I've given one example about GP referrals for cancer treatment. So we can look at this month versus this month a year ago on a whole range of conditions, and I'll be staggered if they're not all down. So we can see that, and we can make a judgment about the extent to which that is, in the long-term interests of our society, more damaging than taking some measures to relax the lockdown, given the fact that we have made, or hope to make in the course of the next few weeks, significant progress in reducing the incidence of COVID. Now, I do come back to the point that we have made a lot of progress already. If R was over 3, and it's now down to 0.7, members of the public have made a really big impact on that, and it's to their credit that that's happened. But we still don't have enough headroom in the system from where it was, from where we are just now, to being able to take some measures of relaxation. But the framework that we've set out tries to essentially marshal all of these different harms in a way that is designed to address Mr Tompkins' fundamental point, which is that there isn't just one harm facing our society today, which is COVID harm. There's 3 other harms. There's non-COVID health harm, there's economic harm, and there's social harm. So it's a completely fair premise. It's the premise on which the framework document is set. And what we're trying to do in thinking through what might be the steps we take in response to this, to try to address some of the dilemmas that Mr Tompkins and other colleagues have put to me this afternoon about what might be the right and correct first steps to take.
Again, that's very helpful, and I thank the Deputy First Minister for that. Final question from me, just to kind of give one possible example of the kinds of things that in the generality we've been talking about. Over the course of the weekend in the press, it was one of the ideas that was floated was that we might be able to take steps towards ending social isolation by enabling people to have, I think they were described as bubbles of 10 in the press. How low would the R number have to be for a step like that to be taken? Are we more than halfway there? Or is that just an unanswerable question?
I'm afraid I'm going to take the unanswerable option here. The committee will forgive me, because that bubble option might be one that might be pursued. But the point that Mr. Tompkins' questions have helpfully allowed me to explain is that every bit of headroom above R and below the point at which the health service is unable to function, used up by one of these options, whether it's the bubble option or schools returning or opening up the health service for more non-COVID health interventions, takes up some of that headroom, and it can't be used twice. So we would have to accept that, and I completely understand this point. People are feeling social isolation within our society. I can see it, I can feel it, I understand it. And if we decided that was to be our priority, we should do that. And this is what the framework document tries to do, in the full and certain knowledge that because we've done that, we can't do something else.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Swinney. I'm going to go next to Stuart Stevenson, please.
Deputy First Minister, Section 7 of the framework document is about adjusting to a new normal. Now, as somebody in his 8th decade, I have particular interest in adjusting to this new normal. At the bottom of page 22, the document says the austerity-driven response to the 2008 financial crash did not work and worsened the inequality that was part of its cause. We must not repeat those mistakes. Clearly looking forward to a post-pandemic world, if not necessarily a post-COVID world, we're going to all, I think, want a more equal society in which we can modify our behaviours to achieve that. To what extent is the government got some people thinking about that, beginning to see what lessons we can learn from the way society is now working that we might apply post-pandemic, if not post-COVID?
We are exploring these points, Convener. I think the experience of COVID has, I think, forced society to recalibrate some of its understanding of who we really rely on in our society for it to work effectively. I'm conscious, we all appreciate and understand now, to I think a much greater extent than we have ever done before, the significance of the contribution by those involved in health and social care in our society and its absolute fundamentals. But equally, we've all been able to have access to food supplies during this whole process, and that's a product of the contribution of many individuals who will not be handsomely rewarded within our society. So I think the debate which has ensued about, particularly in the moments of acute, grave financial hardship for individuals, where the debate about a universal basic income has become much more prominent and significant in our society, I think is an illustration of that point. So the government is, of course, looking at these questions, and as Mr. Stevenson will appreciate, questions like this have a bearing on the programme for government that we bring forward, and ministers will be reflecting on these issues once we are. I think the committee will understand that ministers are pretty much consumed by COVID-only issues just now, but we have got some of our team looking further ahead to identify what might be the appropriate course of action to take.
I think that farmers and fishermen and all the staff who work for them will very much welcome the tenor of the Deputy First Minister's remarks. I don't think I have anything more I wish to ask.
Okay, thank you, Stuart Stevenson. We are now going to go back to Annabel Ewing, hopefully that on the third attempt we can hear you, Annabel.
Well, good afternoon, convener. Thank you. I hope you can.
We can, yes.
Excellent. Okay, third time lucky. Yes, I was wanting to make the point, and it was one that was alluded to by the Deputy First Minister in his opening remarks, where he praised the hugely commendable buy-in from the people of Scotland to the lockdown measures thus far, which of course has been pivotal in us seeing the progress we have been able to see in suppression at this point. And you know, a number of members have raised this issue as well. And I just wanted to seek clarification that it wouldn't just be, as the judgment of Solomon has to be exercised over the next steps with all the competing issues that we've discussed this afternoon. But I just wanted to seek clarification that it won't just be in the kind of generality that the perceived likelihood of buy-in from the people of Scotland will be factored in, but with regard to each specific decision and the consequences of one decision being made for other things not therefore happening or being relaxed. I think that would be really important to ensure that we can see success going forwards.
I think one of the challenges in dealing with the question that Annabel Ewing has raised is that there may well be competing priorities that come forward from that discussion. I just go back to the questions that Adam Tompkins raised with me a moment ago. And what I was trying to get across there was the fact that there is a limited amount of there will be a limited amount of headroom between where the R number is and the point at which we are in danger of overwhelming the National Health Service. And it will not be enough to afford all of the priorities that people might wish us to do. So we may have to make the judgment of Solomon about what will be the priorities that we decide to pursue. Where will we say, well, we think there's a greater importance of doing this versus that? But crucially, the commitment I give to the committee, and which I think is inherent in the document that the First Minister has published, is that the government will be open and transparent about the decisions it has made and why it has made them. And obviously, we'll stand scrutiny on the basis of all of that, as we would expect to. But I certainly can't say that it will be possible for us to do all of the things that are put to us, because I just simply don't believe there will be sufficient headroom between the R number and the challenges for the health service that prompted us to act in the way that we've acted over the last couple of months.
Within the limited headroom that we're likely to have for the next steps, will it not therefore be crucial that, given that it is hoped that there will be at least some variation on where we are, albeit perhaps more limited than people would realistically hope, but given that and this introduction of new issues and new circumstances and new rules, if you like, will it not be crucially important that there are very, very clear demarcation lines as to what is okay, what isn't okay, and that this is crystal clear so that you keep this important buy-in so people continue to understand why something's being done and why something isn't being done?
I think that's an absolutely crucial point, because, and it's a point that's made to us very clearly by the Chief Constable as well, if I can go to that end of the spectrum, because Chief Constable is able to be very clear with his officers and with the public about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in the current context. The minute we move away from that, that becomes an awful lot more difficult to enforce. So if we go back to Mr. Tompkins' question and the question of a bubble of 10 people, well, I might have my bubble of 10 people for Wednesday afternoon, but I might have a different bubble of people for Thursday afternoon. And there's absolutely no way the police can say which, have I got two bubbles or have I just got the one bubble? So it gets inevitably a bit more complicated and complex. So we have to be very mindful of these questions when we take the next tentative steps that we take when that opportunity arises.
And one final question, if I may, Convener. When we get to that stage, whenever that is and whatever it actually will entail, can I seek clarification that actually these crucial matters, they're not just legalistic points, but crucial matters of perhaps variations in interpretation and differing views on interpretation are in fact kept under constant review so that they can be tackled head on before there's a fraying at the edges of compliance?
One of the crucial questions that we've wrestled with throughout the COVID experience has been the necessity for clear, understandable communication around all aspects of what we are asking members of the public to do. And that has been something that has consumed a huge amount of thinking within government to make sure that we get those messages correct and that we present them in the most effective way to members of the public. So there are huge challenges in so doing, but I give Annabel Ewing and the committee the assurance that that will be very much at the heart of the thinking that we take forward to try to address these questions.
Okay, can I thank you, Annabel, for those questions? I'm glad we could finally get to hear from you. And can I thank you, Mr. Swinney, for your time this afternoon and for your engagement with the committee. And I'm sure we will continue to have dialogue with the government in the weeks ahead as we scrutinise legislation and consider some of the wider issues going forward into the future. So with that, I think we'll suspend briefly for about 5 minutes before we move on to the next session. Thank you. Right, if members are ready, we can reconvene. The next item on the agenda is taking evidence on the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions Scotland Amendment number 2 Regulations 2020, SSI 2020/126. And we have with us this afternoon Michael Russell, who is Cabinet Secretary for Constitution, Europe and External Affairs in the Scottish Government. And I welcome Mr. Russell back to the committee this afternoon. And can I invite you to introduce and speak to the regulations before us? Mr. Russell, I'm sorry. Sorry, Mr. Russell, I'm sorry. We missed the start of your comments there. Can you just start again, please?
As I explained, Convener, last Friday, it is presently my responsibility to take forward the legislative part of the Scottish Government's response to the pandemic. This includes the regulations that give effect to various aspects of the lockdown. As some of the activity on the legislative response precedes the establishment of the committee, it might recap to the background because these are amending regulations. The lockdown regulations came into force on the 26th of March. The regulations were made using the made affirmative procedure and they came into force immediately after they were made. The regulations were approved by resolution of Parliament on the 1st of April 2020. Minor textual adjustments were made to the principal regulations by amending regulations. The principal regulations make a number of provisions for the lockdown. Broadly, these cover requiring people to stay at home except for very limited purposes, closing certain businesses and venues, and stopping public gatherings of more than 2 people in public except for very limited purposes. The regulations need to be reviewed at least once every 21 days. The First Minister announced the outcome of the first review of the restrictions and requirements set out in the principal regulations on the 16th of April. The outcome of that review was that the requirements and restrictions remain necessary. The next review period ends on the 7th of May. The Scottish Government made amending regulations by way of made affirmative procedure on the 21st of April. Those amendments entered into force immediately after being made, and a plenary vote on the amending regulations is planned for next week. The amending regulations make a number of adjustments to the principal regulations. They are to adjust areas where the regulations could operate more effectively, to ensure physical distancing is maintained as widely as possible, and to clarify specific circumstances to remove any ambiguity from the principal regulations. The proposals were developed in line with the four nations approach we're taking. Many of the same measures have been taken by the other administrations. The amending regulations strengthen the position already set out in our guidance that all businesses must take all reasonable steps to ensure their employees are able to maintain physical distancing. Businesses must also take reasonable measures to ensure that they admit people into their premises in sufficiently small numbers to maintain a 2-metre distance. Businesses must also take reasonable steps to ensure that distance can also be maintained by people, that is, customers, waiting to enter their premises. Adding this to the regulations extends enforcement powers of local authorities and the police. Where a business is unreasonably not following physical distancing rules, they could be fined or ultimately prosecuted. This ensures that there are additional tools to help address reports of poor social distancing and take measures to reverse those. The amending regulations also make clear that some businesses can remain open. This includes livestock markets, which are critical to the food supply chain in Scotland. It includes a wider range of money and services businesses, including currency exchange and saving clubs, to ensure that people have access to financial services at this difficult time. We've also been clear that holiday accommodation businesses must close at the moment unless they're delivering specific services set out in the principal regulations, such as providing accommodation for key workers. However, I'm sure we're all looking forward to a time in the future when these restrictions can be relaxed. Whilst we do not know when that will be, some companies may wish to take bookings for future dates when they have reopened to the public. The amending regulations enable holiday accommodation services to take online bookings and provide information for future dates when these services are no longer closed, and I stress that. And finally, the amending regulations also make clear that burial grounds and gardens of remembrance associated with crematoriums are able to stay open to the public, although the final decision on this matter will rest with the relevant burial authority. That's the main content of the amending regulations. Let me just touch on future amending regulations, which is linked very closely to the discussions you've just had with the Deputy First Minister. Last week, the government published a paper setting out our thinking on the basis of how future reviews should be carried out. This set out the criteria and the factors which should be considered and the framework on which decisions might be best, and this is clearly a key focus for the government in shaping our response from here on. The First Minister has been clear we want to be open and transparent about the options for Scotland. We'll continue to revisit this issue over the coming days and weeks as we develop that approach. Our assessment framework will inform the required reviews of the lockdown regulations and collective assessment and decision making with the UK government and other devolved administrations as possible. I hope that's been a helpful explanation, and of course I'm happy to answer questions as best I can.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. It's a very helpful outline of the provisions in the regulations, and we have some members with questions to ask about these. If I could maybe just start off on this question of the regulations impacting on business and the requirement for them to socially distance. I see that these are now being extended so that this will apply to all businesses which will be open, and there will be powers given to local authorities and the police to impose fines on those businesses which do not properly follow socially distancing rules. I suppose there are two questions that arise from that to me. First of all, why did the original legislation restrict this to only certain businesses, not all businesses? And why, therefore, has it felt necessary now to extend this? And is there evidence that there is a problem with businesses not complying that requires these regulations now to be brought in with these powers to impose fines?
Well, if you cast your mind back to the start of this process, the issue of social distancing has grown in importance during this time. Now, the question of why not all businesses were included at this first stage, I think, is probably simply to do with dealing with where we expected people to be during that process in the lockdown. I think now, as some businesses have reopened, as we know, there's a number, for example, of stores have reopened, including hardware stores, and a number of businesses, people have returned to work, but they can only do so if it is safe to do so. And this is the primary, or one of the primary tools, because the question of hygiene is obviously extremely important, and so is social isolation if people have symptoms. But it is one of the ways in which we can perhaps normalize the situation. Now, it is not normal to do this, but it will protect people, and therefore we want to make sure they are well protected. In terms of evidence, I think reassurance is important in this as well. Some people have, I think you as a constituency MSPs and other MSPs will know that some people have complained about businesses and having to go to work and being in circumstances which they felt were unsafe. So this gives them reassurance, but it also is a helpful guide to business to know what they need to do to be able to operate in an effective and safe manner. And the method of enforcement of this is important too. It is local authority, environmental health and training standards officers and HSE who will be primarily the people who will look at the businesses. So they're looking at them in the context of safe working spaces. And that's also a wider issue which the four nations are discussing.
Okay, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That's a very helpful explanation of where we are. I'm now going to bring in Annabel Ewing, hopefully, who has some questions.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I just wanted to seek a wee bit of clarity from the Cabinet Secretary. And it's perhaps just my reading of the phraseology, because it talks about these additional tools that the CabSec referred to in terms of fines and potential prosecution, and the test being unreasonably failed to secure the social distancing. So that begs the question, what if you reasonably fail? And it's not just semantics, because the underlying issue then is, if you cannot, as a employer, ensure the social distancing that is required, then presumably you can't open. And presumably if you do open, and notwithstanding all the best efforts that you take to try to make that work within the kind of premises that you have, but it doesn't work, then presumably you can't stay open. I'm just trying to seek clarification what the actual position would be here. Thank you.
That would be absolutely true. If a business cannot operate safely, it should not be open. I mean, that is absolutely axiomatic, because the risk of not being able to operate safely is a risk to people's lives. So a reasonable failure is nonetheless a failure, and it should not be happening.
Okay, Annabel, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Fine, I'll bring in next Stuart Stevenson. I think you have a question, Stuart.
Thank you, Convener. I've got one substantive question, which is just in relation to auction houses, to whether the relaxations and the provisions also allow private trading of animals between individual farmers, because that's something that goes on as well. Particularly at this time of year, we can see calves and sheep being traded. The other one is perhaps an observation response. As someone who's coming to this relatively new, because of course I'm an eighth decader and excluded from Parliament, I'm finding the depths of changes in the legislation quite difficult to follow. And I know that the legislation.gov.uk website takes a long time to reflect changes back to original legislation. Clarity is important. Is there any chance we might see clarity in that regard? This is not a new question. It's to add, Cabinet said.
On the second issue, I think it is important we prioritise the core messages. The detail is often something that is not necessarily accepted for people unless they are in a particular circumstance. For example, the issue of money advice centres is only really relevant to a comparatively small group of people. There may be demand for them, but in terms of provision, it's only a comparatively small group of people. So let's stick to the main messages. And the main messages are the messages of stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. How that is done, then there are issues of ensuring social distancing and making sure that people are not going out. And those are the main messages we take from these things and promote, and we'll go on doing so. But it is necessary to make changes to regulations. That's necessary in normal times. When regulations are put together, as they've had to be put together quickly, inevitably there are issues that have to change. I mean, small matters I see almost every day that are just trying to be dealt with, but the main messages are in here and clear. I have to say on the question of individual trading, my initial reaction would be to think that that is not a regulated business per se, but I would not want to say anything that was either untrue or unhelpful. So thank you, Mr. Stevenson. As ever, you have required more work from ministers and their officials. I shall ask for a response to that to be provided and provided to the committee. But my initial reaction would be that a private transaction is a private transaction. But of course, the two farmers involved would have to observe strict social distancing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart Stevenson. And now we have a question from Monica Lennon.
Thank you, Convener. Good afternoon, Cabinet Secretary. You mentioned in your opening statement that the regulations brought some clarity around access to burial grounds. I know there have been questions from the public about access to cemeteries, aside from the issue of attending funerals, but for people who would tend to visit a grave, to lay flowers, particularly on an anniversary. So does the regulations provide some clarity on that? You mentioned that it's still a matter for individual local authorities about individual cemeteries, but is there a sort of general rule of thumb on this? And do people worry about being stopped by the police if they're on their way to lay flowers on a grave, perhaps on their own or with their family households?
Distress to feel that this was oppressive or difficult in any way. What the situation is, and it's a good question, what the situation is that the previous regulations left this somewhat ambiguous, and I think it was important that the regulations made it clear, but they do not, and the point you're making I think is a good one, they do not lay a duty upon the operators or owners of burial grounds to do this. That is still a discretionary matter for them, and they will want to judge that on a variety of criteria, I suspect, including the ability to staff those areas, the ability to make sure that social distancing is observed, all those matters. But there is no blanket ban on that, which was the interpretation some were putting on it. Nor would one wish to, have to be very straight, a blanket ban on people visiting the graves of their loved ones. That would, and any garden of remembrance. But it also has to be done within the social distancing. It has to be done within the bar on groups of people meeting together. So it would be with the immediate household and nobody else, and it would have to be done carefully. But there is no blanket ban. But of course, the safe view of the owners and operators of the grounds and gardens of remembrance associated with crematorium or burial grounds would now be possible.
That's very helpful clarification. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any other members who have questions to ask to the Cabinet Secretary, so we will move on to item 3 on the agenda. And I'd ask you, Cabinet Secretary, if you would move motion S5M 21572, that the COVID-19 Committee recommends that the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions Scotland Amendment No. 2 Regulations 2020, SSI 2020/126 be approved.
I so move. I think that might have been the first virtual moving of a secondary instrument, but I move it.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Does any member wish to comment at this point? I'm not hearing if any members. I'm therefore going to assume that members are agreeable to passing that motion. If any member disagrees, can they please indicate that now? Thank you. I'm not seeing any disagreement, and therefore we are taking that motion as agreed. And the committee will now publish a report to Parliament setting out our decision on the statutory instrument in the coming days. That was our last item on the agenda. Can I thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for joining us? Can I thank members? And then I'll close the meeting.
Thank you.